Over the next few days, I was little more than a ghost haunting the motel grounds. I drifted from room to room trying to cobble together a purpose. I had quickly realised that I was bound to this property, and whether it was an ancient family curse or a legal contract, I was supposed to stay here and maintain the property. I felt obligated to protect my sister, even if she barely resembled the little girl I remembered. My mother, for all her faults, had done what she could do to protect her daughter. Working over the events in my mind and recounting the visits of the family, I had come to the conclusion that my parents had made a deal to save my sister. I remember her illness. I remember her withering away before my eyes. She was going to die. It was a fact. But somehow, she didn't. She continued living as an eternal child, cursed to walk an ever-evolving earth as she herself was frozen in prepubescence. They had changed her, and I was determined to figure out how. I looked for clues in my father's old lockbox, but found little more than unfamiliar photos and documents that no longer had any relevance. One thing that stood out, though, was an early memento that my grandfather had kept. It was the first brochure for the cave system. If not for the scribbled red circle on the map, it may have been worth something. I spent an entire day sifting through the dirt in the space below their room. The soft earth that filled their mounds was starting to change. With the exception of what I assume was the teenage boys, the dark earthen mounds were starting to dry and crumble. The boys' spot was still dark with a fresh dampness about it, though it grew more dry and brittle with every passing day. The salty, crystalline rocks placed near each mound seemed to draw out whatever moisture was in the dirt, drying it into a dead, useless dust. The crystals themselves were not unique, nor rare by any means. They were the same ones that lined the ceiling and floors in the deepest chambers of the caverns. I remembered them from my childhood visits. I felt a strange longing to return there. I needed to uncover its secrets. While they'd been closed for almost a year now, there was still a park ranger named Graham, who remained on the premises. He would sometimes stop by for some of our free lobby coffee, always overpaying. He joked that we were the only coffee shop in town, which was partially true. I hadn't seen him in a few months, but his truck would pass regularly. As he would survey the outlying grounds, I could tell he was bored, and I thought that I could manipulate that into an eagerness to help me. I called ahead, but the line went straight through to an automated recording, an apology to potential visitors about the indefinite closure. With little else to do, I made some coffee and filled a thermos for him. I drove down to the closed lot and parked just outside the lock fence. I could see his truck parked inside, so I knew he was there. He saw me arriving on the security camera, so he was already greeting me with a wave as I crossed the closed parking lot. "Afternoon, Graham," I shouted on approach. "What brings you down here?" "Research," I said, asking myself the same question. "When was the last time you made here?" "Years, my folks were still around." "Well, there's a lot to see. The remodel finished right before the shutdown. I've been dying to show somebody around, so I'm glad you're here," he said, opening the door. I gave him the coffee and his eyes went wide. He stopped coming by after I closed up shop, so I could tell he was grateful to have one last cup. We walked into the dimly lit lobby, potent with the smell of new carpet and fresh paint. "Wait here while I go turn everything on," he said, clearly excited. I stood in the darkness for almost a minute before the lights came on with the quiet hum of electric life. The lobby was filled with media displays of the cavern's history. There were photos and stories of opening day with updates for each anniversary. As I waited for Graham to return, I studied the older photos behind the glass case nearest to me. Suddenly, the hairs on my neck stood straight. I swore I could feel someone watching me. It was only then that I noticed his gaze staring back from one particularly old photograph. In it, a familiar figure stood at the centre of a group of visitors looking back at me. It was the old man from the family. It was as if he was somehow staring at me through the photo, his eyes locked on the lens of the camera and in turn, on me. It was hard to discern his age in that old faded photo, but he looked very much the same as he did today. The only difference was that instead of his usual grey suit, he was wearing a park ranger uniform. "Ah, you've met Jerry," said Graham with a laugh. "Jerry?" I asked. "I mean, we don't actually know his name, but we all call him Jerry. He was one of the first rangers to work the park. Him and his colleagues were responsible for a lot of the early mapping of the cave system. This photo and a bunch of other stuff was found locked in an old utility closet. Didn't even know it existed because that particular cave was closed off. Check it out," he said, leading me over the illustrated map covering the entire wall. He pointed to a blank spot of the map. Found it right there, actually. I brought my grandfather's old brochure, so I pulled it out to compare to the current map. The blank tunnel he was pointing to still existed on my grandfather's map. Yeah, they left out a few of the trickier spots on the new maps. They didn't want to entice explorers into places they may not get out of, he said. May not get out of? I asked. Yeah, steep inclines, drop-offs, or just plain tight squeezes. They left those spots off, and the map you see today is just the safest. What we call vanilla trails. I showed him the red circle at the end of a pathway that they decided to omit in the modern map. Any idea why that is circled? I asked. Looks like the gulch, or at least whatever is past it. What's past it? What's the gulch? I asked. Not much to tell. It's one of those steepest descents and it's almost impassable without gear or a ladder. Which is a shame, really. I hear it's the most beautiful place in the system. It's got very unique veined stalagmites. Like this? I said, pulling the crystalline rock from my pocket. You're showing me a federal offence. I hope you know that, he said with a chuckle. What? I asked, not expecting that response. You are literally showing me plundered goods. Where did you even get it? My grandfather's collection, I confessed. They were a little more willy-nilly with the rules back then. Everybody was taking tokens and souvenirs. Before the Tucker Boy, they kind of let people just roam, he said, pointing at a photo of well-dressed folks climbing a dangerous rock formation. What happened to the Tucker Boy? I asked. No clue. That was the problem. They looked for him for weeks. He was visiting with his wife and son and went missing. Well, right around the gulch actually, which is why it's not on the maps, he said with another educational chuckle. I thought you said he was a boy. 18, but he was married with a son. Times were different back then. Graham walked over to another glass case, away from the main display. They've talked about taking this down for the renovation. I mean, it is a little dark, he said, pointing at a display of old missing persons photos spanning the decades of the park's operations. I had no idea, I gasped. That's him, right there, Mr. Tucker himself, he said, pointing at a class photo of a face I knew all too well. The teenage boy from the family stared back, younger and happier. I was transfixed, but Graham was already moving on. Listen, I got nothing on the docket today, so if you want, I can take you close to the gulch. I just got to get some lights, he said, already on his way to get the back room. As I waited for his return, I made my way to the elevators that would bring us down into the caverns. The gift shop was located just across from them, so it would be the first thing visitors would see when they resurfaced. Cheesy t-shirts, postcards, and other junk were crammed into the small space. The entire shop seemed to be designed to frame a bookshelf filled entirely with copies of a history book about the caverns. Curious, I opened the book and flipped through the first few pages. It was as if the old man was haunting me through time itself. Again, his blank stare caught my eyes immediately. Looking out from a full-page photograph of a staff photo inside the largest chamber of the caverns, it was labelled as October 23rd, 1924, 1 year after opening day. Even in his friendly park ranger uniform, his presence was so chilling that I almost missed her. Holding the hand of the old man was the teenage girl. She looked very much the same, but thinner and more gaunt. My attention was suddenly stolen by the cluttered clank of Graham approaching with his gear. "Did he have a daughter?" I asked, pointing at the photo of the old man. Graham leaned over to give a half-involved glance. "Like I said, we don't even know his real name," he said with a half shrug. He then walked over and hit the button for the elevator. His excitement was doing nothing to soften my growing anxiety over the photographs. The ride down took longer than I remembered, and my ears popped from the pressure change as we descended deep underground. As soon as the elevator doors opened into the first chamber, Graham disappeared into the darkness. "Wait here," he said, stepping out. I followed, but stopped right outside the elevator. The dim emergency lights cast haunting shadows across the cavern walls. It was just enough light for Graham to navigate without his flashlight. I could hear nothing but his footsteps and the muffled silence of the stale cavern air. When he reached his destination, his footsteps ceased and the silence settled in. To my right, I heard a distant flutter, and what I thought was a faint screech. A loud mechanical click signalled the lights turning on and filling even the deepest corners of the cavern with comforting light. Graham returned, and with a wave he ushered me to follow him. "All right, let's start this private tour," he said, heading in the direction of the eerie sounds I had just heard. "There's no creaky plumbing down here, is there?" I asked, remembering the sink in the old house. "Nope, all creaky sounds are natural cave occurrences," he joked. I hoped. I followed him anyway. The walk through the main chambers and less travelled paths was long, and filled mostly with small talk. Graham lamented on the fact that reopening wasn't guaranteed despite the money they spent on the remodel. He truly loved the caverns and couldn't see himself doing anything else. "People would die for this gig. It's the creme de la creme of park service posts. I realise how lucky I am to have it," he said with a tinge of real sadness. It became obvious that we were reaching the end of the modern map, because the lights started to stagger more with longer distance between each light. The fixtures themselves were older than the rest, and some were entirely out, creating breaks of darkness in the already dim cavern. Each time we reached an old iron gate, he would search a massive key ring for the one out of dozens of keys that would open it. Eventually, the lights no longer lit our way and he switched on the lamps and handed me a helmet. "I probably should have given you this earlier, but these low ceilings make it a necessity now," he said with a smile. I followed behind in a half crouch as he pointed out interesting geological sites that had been hidden from the public for decades. I noticed that some of the cave walls were starting to display that same dark red and blue mineral veins as the crystal I had collected from their chamber. "What's that?" I asked, pointing to rune carvings I recognised from the room below the motel. "No idea what it says. Old-timey graffiti, I guess," he assured me. As the ceilings and walls seemed to close in around us with each step, the warm air seemed thicker as well. I felt as though it was getting difficult to breathe and my back was stretching to ache from the unnatural posture. Graham must have sensed my discomfort. "It opens up a little bit further ahead. We're almost there," he said, trying to comfort me. He was right, and as soon as we reached the next chamber, the air seemed to grow colder as well. The floor that had until now been paved with a gripping cement had given way to the cavern's natural floor, a slippery surface that felt very much like sandstone. "I present the Gulch," he said, while grabbing a hold of my jacket to prevent me from passing him. He switched on a very bright lantern and and lit up the enormous room. My breath left my lungs as I noticed why it grabbed a hold of me. The steep drop-off was only a few feet ahead, and it was more of a cliff than an incline. It dropped down maybe 20 or 30 feet into a lower tunnel that led into further darkness. "How do we get down?" I asked, leaning forward to get a better look. "We don't. Tour stops here. If we get so much as sprain an ankle, we're pretty much done for. No self-service, nobody knows we're here, and nobody will come looking for weeks. That level of irresponsibility would cost me my job," he said, finally serious. But his adherence to the rules went out the door when we heard that haunting sound. A faint cry echoed out from the darkness past the gulch. "The bats make it down this far?" I asked, my voice shaky and afraid. I watched his mind wrestle with the possibilities as he shook his head slowly. "Then what was that?" I asked. He turned to me, his eyes wide and afraid. He shook his head again. As my own voice echoed down the cavernous path ahead, the sound ceased, as if hearing me. In those brief moments of silence when we still shared a doubt that we'd heard anything at all, I could feel him pull my jacket to lead me back out, but then we heard it. "You've returned," asked a voice from the distant darkness. It sounded like an echo, without a voice to reflect. I could feel Graham's body tense and stiffen with the acceptance that what we heard was very real, and not from our own imaginations. "What have you brought me?" it called out, vulnerable and afraid. "Nobody should be down there. How did you get down there?" Graham asked as if he wanted an answer from himself and not the ghostly voice below. There was a moment when neither spoke. It was as if both of them were working out what to say next. "Who's up there? Please help," it said, the voice now small and almost childlike, more vulnerable than before. "I'm a park ranger. I can help you," he said, and I realized that it was now me holding onto his jacket, trying to hold him back. "Stay where you are," he called out to the childlike voice in the darkness. He turned to me with a look of defeat or unwanted heroism. "We have to help," he choked out. "Do we?" I asked as he moved past me into an old metal utility trunk just to the right of the room. As he struggled to find the key that opened the trunk, I peered into the darkness looking for any sign of movement. For a moment, I thought I saw a small pale form move just beyond the edge of the shadows, but my attention was soon taken by the metal groan of the trunk opening. Graham pulled out a rope ladder that attached to the side of the already secured trunk and dropped it below. The ladder unraveled along the steep incline all the way to the floor. "I've been trapped. Please come down and help me," the childlike voice said, slowly losing all emotion, the urgency replaced with a calm sense of command. I followed after Graham as he descended down the ladder. As my hands grazed the coarse, granular texture of the cavern wall, it felt as if the moisture was drawn from my skin. With each laboured step down, the cold, dry air stung my lungs. By the time I reached the bottom, Graham was already halfway across the gulch with the lantern held high. Somehow, the light seemed to sit still at the edge of the shadowy darkness ahead. "How did you get down here?" he asked, walking slowly towards the darkness ahead. "I've always been down here," said the voice, its childlike essence giving way to a frightening growl. At the edge of the darkness, Graham stopped to adjust the lamp, doing everything he could to cast more light towards the unseen voice. With his attention on the lamp, Graham didn't even see it coming. He had no time to react. A pale white figure emerged from the darkness and skittered across the cavern floor, grabbed Graham by the ankles and pulled him to the ground. The lantern shattered on impact. I stood there frozen at the bottom of the ladder, my own light only casting a few feet in front of me. "Graham!" I I called out. "Run!" he responded in a gurgled, gasping moan. So I climbed. I climbed faster than I thought possible, skipping rungs with each aching pull as my muscles worked on instinct and adrenaline. I could feel the cold, wet patter of naked flesh hitting the cavern floor as the figure raced towards me. When I reached the top of the ladder, I glanced back to see the figure pulling itself across the floor with an unnatural speed. As I turned to pull the ladder up, my light cast just far enough to reach the bottom of the gulch. A withered, claw-like hand covered in bright, red blood reached out and grabbed the bottom rung. It pulled with an inhuman strength. I braced myself and pulled back. I could hear its other hand clawing at the sandpaper-like surface of the cavern wall, struggling to gain footing. I looked to my right, into the open utility trunk. Sitting atop a coil of rope and other gear was a silver-coated pickaxe. As I felt myself teetering on the edge of falling, I let go of the rope. I grabbed the pickaxe and in one fluid motion I swung hard, severing one side of the rope ladder. But still, it climbed. The shriveled torso of a ghost white child covered in Graham's blood. It looked up from below with soulless black eyes. There was no fear, only hunger. From its waist hung long strips of withered flesh and mangled bone, what I assume were once its legs. The creature made it halfway up the ladder before I swung again, fraying the remaining side of rope. The creature did not slow, undeterred by my pickaxe. My mind raced as I considered my next swing, the rope or the creature. I wasn't sure if the next blow would cut the rope, but I was even less sure that I could kill whatever it was that was climbing. I swung. The rope snapped and the ladder fell below. The creature slid back down the incline, hitting the bottom with a sickening, wet thud. I waited with bated breath as I listened for movement. I called out hopelessly into the darkness. "Graham!" "He is no more," said the voice from directly below. I swallowed hard and held my lantern over the edge as the shadows crept back that revealed the creature below. I expected a crumpled, broken mess from the fall, but instead, there it was, staring up at me, unfazed. Though its resemblance to a human was slight, I could see aspects of the family in its emotionless stare and pale waxy skin beneath wet, red blood. The naked figure was child-sized, but its limbs and features were distorted, odd and long. Its bulbous veiny head held two bulging black eyes within thin lips that barely restrained sharp, jagged teeth. It looked as though it may have been human at one time, but its form now was nothing more than a legless, emaciated ghoul with dry and withered skin. Its few remaining strands of hair were matted down with wet blood. "Will you please help me out?" it asked. "Why are you down here?" I cried. "They took my legs and left me to rot," it said with its shark-like eyes locked on mine. "Who?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "I gave her the gift, but she turned on me. I can give you the gift too if you help me up," it sneered. "How?" I asked. "I will drink from you, and you will drink from me, and when you slumber beneath this salted earth, it will leach out the very essence of death from your being. We can live here together forever, but each night you will follow me here, and we will die beneath the crystalline earth, only to wake at night revived by the salted soils," it said, digging its claws into a patch of loose, gravelly sand. My fingers tightened around the pickaxe. "What's stopping you from killing me once I help you?" I asked. "Solitude. Eternity is meaningless if you are alone." "What about Graham?" I asked, pointing into the darkness. "Can you bring him back?" "He is not worthy of the gift. You must choose it. He is nothing more than a meal, sustenance after a famine. But you, I can smell the gift on you. You know of my children. You know what it means." "If they're your children, then why are you here?" I asked. She accepted the gift, and we lived for years preying on the weak that wandered into our realm. And then he arrived and stole her attention from me. When she gave him the gift, he convinced her to leave our home. When I refused to let her go, he took my legs and they left me down here to starve. But as I said, death does not come easy down here, not for us. If I help you, you can make me like you, I asked, my voice shaky and unsure. Yes, it smiled. I looked down at the silver axe in my hands. I thought back to the silver-tipped bullets in my grandfather's box. He must have known. This pickaxe was here for a reason, coated in shimmering silver. I knew what I had to do. I tied off the coiled rope in the box and dropped it down. The creature quickly grabbed hold and pulled itself up, one clawed hand over the other. It climbed as its mangled lower half dangled below. I stepped back and readied myself. As the creature crested the incline and pulled itself onto my level, I raised the pickaxe high over my head. Quickly, I brought it down onto the creature's skull with a sickening crunch. I let go and the blood-covered ghoul fell forward onto the ground in front of me slowly. It turned its head, and the black, expressionless eyes locked on mine. Silly, silver slows, but cannot kill us. It smiled, baring its rows of sharp teeth. As it wrapped its sickeningly long fingers around the handle of the axe, I reached into my pocket. It pulled at the handle, trying to free the pickaxe from its head, too focused on what was in my hand. I lurched forward with the only weapon I had left, the sharp crystalline rock. But the creature was fast and swiped at my feet with an incredible quickness, just as it did with Graham. I fell backwards hard and hit my head on the rocks, but the helmet saved me from an almost certain concussion or worse. I was still woozy when the creature climbed on top of me, the pickaxe still embedded in its skull. With one arm, I fought it back, holding it by the neck. With the other, I gripped crystalline rock. With its face only inches from mine, I closed my eyes, plunged it into the creature's chest. Almost immediately, the skin around the puncture withered and cracked as the rock leached the life from the creature. I pushed it off me and crawled backwards. The creature's blank stare gave way to true horror as it looked down at the fatal, piercing blow. Confused, its hands weakly clawed at the embedded stone. I stood up and removed the axe from its skull. Again, I raised it high and then brought it down hard. This time, the skull collapsed beneath the blow. Its flesh crumbled in decay until nothing but dust and blood sat before me, soaking into a sludgy mess. Confident that I had ended this ancient evil, I pushed curdled blood and mudded flesh into the gulch below. I then used the rope to climb back down into the gulch, unwilling to take the creature's word that Graham was gone. As I stepped into the darkness, the ground squished beneath me. I directed the light to my feet and the massive amounts of blood that surrounded them. I found Graham only a few feet into the darkness. His body was cold, but I could have sworn I still felt a pulse. Blood oozed from large gashes in his throat, stomach, and arms. Still, I had to try. He was heavy, but I managed to drag him all the way back to the rope. It was only then that I had the realization that there was no way I could get him out. Not on my own. By the time I could find help, he would surely be dead, and if he were dead, I would have to explain why. The creature that inflicted his wounds was nothing more than blood-soaked dust, which made for a poor explanation. They would ask how I found him, what happened, and how we could have lost so much blood without a jagged rock in sight. I stood there, watching his blood slowly ooze out into the grainy sand beneath, mixing with the discoloured sludge of the creature that had killed him. I made peace with my only viable option. I would leave him here and hope that by the time they found him, it would look like he fell, climbing down. I didn't want my friend to stay here forever, but just long enough to not incriminate me with defensive wounds. I knew that he would understand. We both witnessed an unnatural evil, and there was no way anybody else would believe it, not without evidence. I pulled my crystalline stone from the bloody muck and stuffed it back into my pocket. After I said my goodbyes to Graham, it took me hours to find my way back out of the caverns. Back in the gift shop, I cleaned myself up and did my best to remove any evidence I had visited. I even returned the helmet to the rack after wiping away any trace of blood. I was tired and weak by the time I stumbled outside into the night. I drove home in a daze and barely remembered crawling into bed. The days that followed were heavy with guilt and sorrow. Graham lost his life because of my foolish actions, and even though it meant the evil down there was finally gone, I couldn't help but wish it was me instead of Graham that was still down there, rotting, waiting to be found. On the third day after the events in the cavern, I was awoken mid-afternoon by a knocking at the office door. I expected to open it to a weary traveller, but instead I found myself face to face with the sheriff, who lowered his sunglasses and cut right to the point. "Mind if I come inside? I got questions about. I have a feeling you might know something." Sure, I said, breathless and already worried. I led him inside the office and he made his way over to the check-in desk. He pulled out a tablet from under the jacket and sat down. "You're familiar with Ranger Graham Nillis?" he asked, his brow furrowed. I glanced at the coffee counter in the lobby and nodded. "You were with him on Thursday, correct?" he asked, as if I had already admitted to it. "I am... with him?" I stumbled. The sheriff turned on the tablet as he navigated it. He said, "We have CCTV footage showing you at the Caverns Visitor Center." Before I could even answer, the video was already playing. I watched myself walking across the parking lot and waving to a smiling, still living Graham. "Yes, I brought him coffee. He used to come in often, but it'd been a while, so I stopped by. Is he okay?" I asked, regretting my last question. The sheriff cocked his head to the side, questioning me. "Just coffee?" he asked. My brain seemed to shut down, overloaded with the possibilities of what he knew, why he was there, and why he hadn't arrested me yet. "Well, he showed me around the renovations," I offered. He nodded, accepting my answer. "Gotcha," he said, already navigating to another video. "Is there a problem? Did he get in trouble?" I asked, feigning ignorance. "Well, there is a problem. Not that you did anything wrong," he said in an almost apologetic manner. He could sense my discomfort and cleared his throat. Before he hit play on the video, he explained. "Did he mention anything strange when you met? Did he seem afraid of anybody, of anything?" "No," I lied. "So, after you left, he missed his rounds. We believe he slept in the center that evening, which isn't illegal. He has late nights and early days, I get it. But when he did emerge late that night, well," he said, hitting play. I watched the grainy video fast forward until the door to the center opened. The sheriff then slowed the video and I watched as Graham staggered out of the visitor center, still alive. I bit my tongue to hide my surprise. "Notice that he's possibly impaired," he said, pointing to Graham as he stumbled across the parking lot. We think he may have hit his head while, well, I don't know, he added. Is he okay? I asked with genuine hope. Without answering my question, he asked another. Do you recognize this car? I watched as the familiar old station wagon pulled into the parking lot. I was too shocked to answer. The family had returned, almost 4 years too early. I watched as they pounced on Graham, but they did not hurt him. Instead, they dragged him to the bed of his own truck and tied him down at the ankles and wrists. His arms and legs were splayed out to each corner of the bed, the two men holding each arm, while the middle-aged woman and older woman held his legs. The teenage girl just stood there, watching him. And even though the footage was grainy, I swear I could see somebody else watching from the car window. My sister. Hold on, you don't need to see this. He stumbled, trying to end the video but instead fast-forwarding it. I watched as the family got back in their car and left, leaving Graham exposed in his truck. I watched as the sun crept across the parking lot as it rose above the trees. I watched his body ignite the moment the sunrise reached his foot. I watched it burn him slowly from his feet all the way to his head until there was nothing more than a charred corpse. I watched my friend die a second time. I'm so sorry, you should not have seen that, he stuttered, finally just powering down the tablet. There was a moment of silence as he let me process the horrific murder I'd just witnessed. We believe they doused him in an unknown accelerant. We're not sure how, but they burnt him alive, just like the young man we found in Henley's truck. We just want to know why. Do you recognize them? He asked. I shook my head in disbelief. We don't know who they are, but we feel they may be responsible for both deaths. He trailed off. I felt my head spin and asked to sit down. Realizing that I just witnessed my friend's death, the sheriff eased up on the questions and tried to soften the situation. He offered me his card and told me to call him if I remembered anything. He left me there on the couch in the lobby, reeling from the realization that I no longer had 4 years to figure it out. They were already here, and that means they would be checking in sooner rather than later. I couldn't help but feel that somehow they knew what I'd done. I needed to come up with a plan to keep myself safe and somehow free my sister from their grasp. But instead, all I could do is replay the last words the sheriff said before I completely shut down. He had pointed again to the frozen frame of the old man, the old woman, the middle-aged couple, and the teenage girl and asked, "Have you ever rented a room to this family?" I lied and told him, "No."